Why hello there, and welcome back to Some Weirdo on the Internet Reviews Obscure Role-Playing Games. And in this episode, I'll be looking at a game that ain't afraid of no ghosts. Ghostbusters International was released in 1989 by West End Games to capitalize on the popularity of Ghostbusters 2, and I am reviewing it now in 2020 to capitalize on the hype surrounding Ghostbusters Afterlife. Also, this is actually the second edition of the Ghostbusters role-playing game. I will be pointing out at some points what was added into the second edition, but I'm not going to be comparing every single point between the two. Players in Ghostbusters International take on the role of Ghostbusters franchisees, running their own ghost-busting businesses and busting aforementioned ghosts, so let's make us a character. The first thing we do is fill in all the stuff that you normally fill in last, so there's all of that. Next we choose a goal for the character, a thing that they work towards, and are rewarded with brownie points upon achieving. Next we are given 12 points to spend on our 4 attributes, and that should do nicely. Then we choose one talent for each attribute, a thing using that attribute that the character is particularly good at. And that is basically it, although I do want to bring up the equipment system, which is kind of interesting. Basically, characters have a number of item slots measured in hands, which is the number of hands needed to hold that item, but also a rough abstraction of size. And weight is also abstracted to how much muscle is required to carry the item without incurring a penalty. That's as much as we can carry, and this character is done. And that's it. Pretty simple. I kinda like it. One thing I do like is how you get one talent for each attribute, so even if your character has a low attribute, there is at least one thing in that area that they are still kinda good with. I also like the way that the equipment is handled. Like, encumbrance is always a pain to deal with, and a lot of games don't even bother addressing volume of your equipment. On the downside, my big issue is that the attributes are kind of poorly defined. Like, there isn't a really good distinction of what you use each attribute for. So a 3 out of 5 for character creation. It is a serviceable system, but nothing really impressive. The biggest advantage here is the simplicity, so yeah. In theory, the rules are fairly simple. When a test needs to be made, the Game Master will choose which attribute is relevant to the situation, and if any talents apply, then set a difficulty. In the first edition, the difficulty levels were fairly straightforward, but Ghostbusters International introduces something called the Universal How Much, or UHM system, which gives you a basic difficulty range, and then you have to select a specific difficulty within that range, which feels kind of unnecessary. So let's say that our character needs to look up some arcane occult lore that is somehow relevant to whatever ghost-busting mission they are currently working on. The GM decides that the task is of a good amount of difficulty, and picks 13 as the actual target because it's spooky. We roll 4 dice for the brains attribute and 3 more from the occult talent for a total of 18. And since the ghost die came up with a ghost, that means that it does not add to the total, and also that something bad will happen. So since our dice roll total exceeds the difficulty, that means that the character succeeds and finds the information they're looking for, but since the ghost came up, that also means that the book of occult lore they were reading spontaneously burst into flames, and they are now banned from the library until they pay for the damages. But I know what you all come here for, the lovely combat illustrations, so let's get to that. So let's say that Stacy and her ghost-busting partner Tucker are out looking for a ghost to bust. Spooky. In combat, characters act in order of their move score, So first up is Stacy, and she fires at the ghost with her proton pack. The difficulty is very little, and the GM chooses 3 because that's the only number that can technically be failed on this roll. Stacy rolls her moves dice to hit, and the ghost rolls its power to dodge. And since the dodge result is unsurprisingly higher than the ranged target, that becomes the new target for the roll. So the attack has succeeded by 7 points, and if we look that up on the UHM damage table, we see that it is 2 points of damage, which is applied to the ghost's ectopresence. Now it's Tucker's turn, and he too busts on the brat with a proton pack, rolling 2 dice and getting 5. The ghost rolls its dodge and gets 6, and a ghost. The ghost always means some negative outcome for the Ghostbusters, regardless of who rolls it. So not only does Tucker miss, he also destroys a priceless antique, which is definitely coming out of his share of the payment from this job. Now it's the ghost's turn, and it uses its poltergeist power to hurl a book at Stacy. So the ghost rolls its power against Stacy's muscles, and the ghost succeeds by 1, which means 1 damage. Stacy can apply this damage to any attribute and chooses brains. Stacy attacks the ghost again, and succeeds by 5 for another 2 damage. Then it's Tucker's turn again, but this time he wants to make sure he hits, so he spends 2 brownie points to add 2 dice to the roll, and succeeds by 6 points, for another 2 damage. But this time the ghost applies 1 damage each to its ectopresence and power. The ghost tries to throw a tasteful bust at Tucker, but since it had to reduce its power, rolls only 1 die, and misses. Stacy blasts the ghost again, taking away its final power and ectopresence points. Then Tucker switches his proton pack to containment and tries to snag the ghost. Since it has no dice to roll, he only needs to meet the range difficulty, which he easily does. The ghost can't take any actions because it is contained and also doesn't have any dice to roll, so Stacy sends out a trap, and this ghost is busted. I like how damage is applied to the attributes and how you get to select which one to take the points away from. It is an interesting little system that you have to make those decisions about which of your attributes you're going to lower when you take damage. I also like the way that the UHM system translates the difference between the difficulty and the roll into a specific level of success or failure or damage or what have you, and that is the last nice thing you're going to hear me say about it. Because it also adds those difficulty levels with a difficulty level within them, and it just kind of adds unnecessary complexity to a game where the numbers are already kinda weird. Like, basically, the more dice you add, the less predictable the outcome is. Which brings me to my biggest issue here, which is the brownie points. You can spend them to add dice to your roll, and you can also spend them to decrease the severity of your failure or your damage. It's just like this big pool of points you have to spend whenever something goes wrong, because the game is kind of poorly balanced. And in the original edition, it wasn't that big of a deal, because the original edition was extremely simple. Like, I basically explained the entirety of the rules at the beginning of this section. So a 2.5 out of 5 for mechanics. They basically tried to add complexity to a system whose greatest strength was its simplicity. And while I do like some of the stuff that they added, it does very much feel like one thing grafted onto another instead of just a single cohesive set of rules. This game actually has a fairly decent amount of content. There is a good amount of items, although significantly more of them than I would have liked are joke items. There's also a fairly comprehensive section for making up all the various spooks that you're going to need to encounter in this game, and a couple of little adventures, and also some capsule adventures, which are basically like a really short concept for an adventure that you are intended to then build out into a full adventure, and just also lots of like advice for running a game, running an adventure, running a whole campaign, all of the stuff that, you know, you should basically expect to find in a role-playing game. So a 2 out of 3 for content. Most of the stuff you need is there, as is a lot of stuff you don't need, but more importantly, there are guidelines for making your own stuff. Alright, so if you were wondering in which section I was going to completely tear into this thing, this is it. Overall, the writing is mostly competent, which is not exactly the bar you want to set for a professionally published game based on a hit movie franchise. One of the biggest issues is the tone. Like, they're just constantly trying to make jokes, but more importantly, they make jokes at the expense of explaining the rules. Like, in the examples given for the various difficulties, they make sure to include one example of a difficulty level for sleeping and one for eating. Like, sleeping is an easy task, but sleeping in a hotel room, that's slightly more difficult. Also, apparently they thought that their joke about eating a telephone being a very difficult task was so hilarious that it is the example they used for explaining how the ghost die works, instead of, you know, something that might ever actually occur in the game. But that's not even the worst of it. When I started reading this book, I was assuming this was the worst of it, but no, the worst is all the things that are inconsistent or just wrong. Some examples. In the player section, it is stated that weapons have a point-blank range of 10 meters, a normal range, which is defined by the weapon, and a long range, which is anything beyond that, and have a specified difficulty for each of those ranges. In the Game Master section, it is stated that weapons have a max range and a range increment, with the difficulty being set by the number of range increments. Also, there's an entire medical history section of the character sheet, which just isn't really used. The section which explains what it is basically just says that it will be explained in the section on getting hurt, and the section on getting hurt doesn't even mention it. The only thing I can figure out is that they had different people working on different parts of the book at the same time, and there was just no communication between them. So someone changed something, the other people just didn't know about it. The layout is very basic, sometimes with intentional breaks, usually without, and a handful of illustrations, pretty much just wherever they had time to stick them. So a 1 out of 3 for writing. Honestly, I want to give it less, but the rules are all still technically understandable, provided that you assume anything in the Game Master section overrules anything in the player section, which you shouldn't have to do. And 3 out of 5 for presentation. It is about as average as you can get. The only thing I actually like about it is that it is separated into a short player section at the beginning and a longer Game Master section after that. Although, ideally, both of those sections would contain the same rules. And there we have it. Ghostbusters International, a bigger and more complex, but not necessarily better Ghostbusters role-playing game. It's not like inherently flawed at its core, it's just so lazily put together that it's just a big tangled mess of why should I care? Like, if they had actually taken the time to work the new rules into the old ones and then rewrite the entire thing to reflect those new rules with a focus on explaining the game first and jokes second, then this could have been a very good game, but they didn't, and it isn't. Alright, so thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit all of the lovely buttons, and if you'd like some more reviews, you can check out my blog where I do that specific thing. There's a link in the description. And as long as you're down there, if there are any games that you think I need to take a look at, you can tell me about them in the comments, and I might. Well, until next time.